HOA Karen hosted a wedding in my yard, so I flooded it with dirty water, entitled People. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. You know, when you move into a new place, there's this little bit of excitement, right? You picture the perfect yard, maybe a garden, a place to unwind after a long day. But for me, it wasn't just about the yard, it was my space, my sanctuary, the place where I could kick back, let my guard down, and just breathe. It was the one part of my life that felt like mine. And of course, like any HOA, homeowners association, would, they had something to say about that. The HOA in my neighborhood, let's just say they're the type that sends out letters if a blade of grass is a fraction of an inch too tall. It's always something. Fix this, trim that. You can't put up a shed here. Little things like that start to eat at you, especially when you're already feeling like you can't even own a patch of grass without someone making sure you're doing it their way. And of course, then there's Karen. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term Karen thrown around before, but let me tell you, this one was the real deal. She wasn't just the type of person to ask for the manager. No, she was the one who was the manager, or at least thought she was. She sat at the top of the HOA food chain, making everyone's life miserable with rules that seemed to have no real reason behind them, except to flex a little bit of power. Every time I turned around, there she was, poking her nose into my business. That fence is too tall, she'd say, even though it was well within the guidelines. You're not allowed to park your truck here, even though it was on my own driveway. I started to feel like I was always walking on eggshells, always trying to follow rules that didn't seem to make sense. And believe me, it didn't stop with the typical neighborhood stuff. Oh no. Karen, in her infinite wisdom, decided to get involved in something far more personal. My yard. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where you just want to sit on your porch with a cold drink and enjoy the peace. But instead, I got a letter in the mail, a letter that had Karen's name all over it. I opened it, and there it was, clear as day. Karen had planned a wedding, right there, in my yard, and she expected me to just be okay with it. There were no apologies, no asking if it was even possible to have this event at my place. No, Karen had decided. She was the one calling the shots, and if I had any objections, well, those didn't matter. She went ahead and booked the wedding for some family members, figuring that it was fine to just drop this on me without warning. And let me tell you, it didn't sit well. My yard, my privacy, was about to be invaded by dozens of strangers, all because she thought she could make that decision for me. And that's when everything just started to boil over. Karen wasn't just any typical neighbor. Oh no, she had that special, something that made her stand out, and it wasn't in a good way. She was the type of person who had a problem with everything. Every little thing you did, every little choice you made, it was as though she saw it as her personal duty to step in and make sure you were doing it her way. If you left your trash cans out a minute longer than necessary, Karen was the one to knock on your door and remind you about the rules, even though those rules weren't written anywhere. If your front lawn wasn't exactly the right shade of green, you could bet Karen would find a way to make sure you knew about it. She'd bring up fines or worse, subtle threats of the HOA stepping in. And that's the thing. She wasn't just a complainer. No, Karen had power. She wielded the HOA like a weapon. She didn't just live in the neighborhood. She was the president of the HOA, the undisputed queen of the neighborhood council. If there was a rule to be enforced, she was the first to bring it up. If there was a fine to be handed out, it was her signature at the bottom. She didn't care if you thought it was unreasonable. She didn't care if it made sense or not. If it was in her head, it was gospel. It didn't help that she was so obsessed with control. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be her version of right. If your house wasn't painted the exact shade of beige that Karen approved, you were getting a warning. If you dared to have a slightly off-center garden gnome, it was a problem. No detail was too small for her to scrutinize. And unfortunately, that scrutiny didn't stop at her own property. She felt entitled to make decisions about everyone else's life. If you didn't mow your lawn exactly the way she thought it should be mowed, she'd lecture you about proper lawn maintenance, as if she was some kind of expert. The worst part? She had this smug little attitude, like she was doing you a favor by helping. You follow the rules she loved to lay down? And the thing about Karen, she didn't just enforce the rules, she lived them. She made sure every neighbor knew she was the one calling the shots, the one who had the final say. She thrived on that feeling of superiority. It was like her identity was wrapped up in controlling everything around her, as if the entire neighborhood needed her to be the boss. To say there was tension between Karen and me would be an understatement. It was like oil and water. I could never get through a conversation with her without feeling like she was trying to tell me how to live my life. She didn't respect boundaries, and every time I tried to assert myself or disagree with her, she'd shoot me down with some legal jargon or HOA rule that always seemed to go in her favor. It felt like no matter what I did, she was always lurking around, waiting for the next opportunity to criticize or overstep. The personality clash was inevitable. I wasn't the kind of person who took kindly to people trying to tell me how to run my own life. And Karen? Well, she wasn't about to back down from her mission. Her idea of control wasn't limited to the little things either. She didn't just want to fix my lawn or tell me how high my fence should be. No, Karen wanted to dictate the entire neighborhood's way of life, and she wasn't afraid to make everyone feel that pressure. It was one of those typical mornings when the sun was just starting to break through the trees, and I was sipping my coffee, trying to shake off the sleep from my eyes. I was scrolling through my phone, zoning out, when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a letter tucked into the mail slot, one of those official-looking envelopes from the HOA. I almost didn't open it. After all, it was just another one of Karen's passive-aggressive notices about my yard or some minor infraction that didn't really matter. But curiosity got the best of me, and as soon as I tore open the envelope, my stomach dropped. It wasn't the usual complaint or fine. No, this time, it was something entirely different. The letter outlined the details of a wedding. A wedding in my yard. It was set for a Saturday afternoon, just 2 weeks away, and Karen had already arranged everything. The flowers, the caterers, the whole damn thing. And here's the kicker. She never bothered to ask for my permission. My mind raced as I read the letter again, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was missing something, I thought. But no, there it was, in black and white. We have chosen your property for a family wedding celebration. Please be prepared for the event on date. If you have any concerns, feel free to contact the HOA directly. What the hell? I felt my blood pressure rising as I reread it. How could she do this? How could Karen, of all people, just decide to have an event like this in my space? My yard wasn't some public park. This was my private property. But Karen, she didn't seem to care about that. I couldn't even process it at first. I stood there staring at the letter in disbelief. Then just as I was about to call the HOA office to demand answers, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a neighbor, someone who'd clearly gotten wind of the plans. Hey, just wanted to let you know, Karen's wedding is happening in your yard. Hope you're cool with it. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Karen hadn't even had the courtesy to tell me personally. Instead, she'd sent a letter, and now my entire neighborhood was talking about it. My backyard, my personal space, was going to be filled with strangers, people I didn't know, all celebrating this wedding without even asking me. I was furious. I marched over to Karen's house, fists clenched. I was done being the nice guy, done letting her push me around. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with that same smug smile she always wore. She already knew what I was about to say. Karen, what is this? I waved the letter in front of her. You didn't even ask me. You can't just have a wedding in my yard. She didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost pleased by my anger. Oh, I don't think you understand, she said in that condescending tone of hers. This is a great opportunity for you. It'll increase your property value, make the whole neighborhood look more prestigious. Think of it as a community event. I could feel the frustration building inside me, tightening like a knot in my chest. It's my yard. I don't want strangers here. I don't want a wedding in my space. It's private. But Karen wasn't having any of it. She shrugged as though my objections were an inconvenience she couldn't be bothered with. You're overreacting, she said, brushing me off like a fly. The HOA already approved everything, and it's a perfect location. Besides, it's already been arranged. You can either be a good neighbor and let it happen, or you can cause trouble. It's up to you. I stood there stunned. There she was, justifying her decision, acting as if she had the right to do whatever she wanted. She didn't care about what I wanted, about my feelings, or about the fact that she was completely disregarding my rights as the property owner. It was clear. This wasn't about the wedding or the event. It was about Karen flexing her muscles, about showing that she had the power to control everything, even my own yard. And at that moment, I realized something. This was the breaking point. This was the last straw. If I let this go, I was going to be giving her permission to do whatever she wanted, not just in my yard, but with my life. The more I stood there listening to her speak, the angrier I got. I had been letting Karen push me around for far too long, and now she had crossed a line. This wasn't just about her wedding. It was about the fact that she felt like she could take whatever she wanted from me without asking, and I wasn't about to stand for it. For weeks I had been simmering, letting little things build up. It wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't just about Karen marching into my yard like she owned it. It was the years of little jabs, the relentless pressure of living under the HOA's thumb, the constant tension in my day-to-day life that had worn me down. It had started with the tiny things, small, inconsequential annoyances that seemed harmless at first, like the time I had the audacity to plant a rose bush in my front yard, and Karen, in all her glory, showed up to tell me it wasn't approved by the HOA. It didn't matter that roses were perfectly legal in the neighborhood. She still managed to send a letter warning me about potential fines, or the time I hung a small flag on my porch in honor of a holiday, and Karen knocked on my door to tell me that flags could only be displayed during certain hours. No one else cared, but for Karen, it was about control. Everything I did was questioned, monitored, and criticized. It was like I was being suffocated, bit by rules that seemed to be designed just to keep me in line. And then it got worse. The HOA started issuing warnings about things that didn't even make sense. The fence I had built to give myself a little privacy, a violation. My mailbox, which had been there for years, too eccentric for their taste. Every time I turned around, there was a new issue, a new complaint. No matter how hard I tried to comply, it was never enough. And Karen? She was always at the center of it all, her sharp, disapproving gaze just waiting for me to slip up. My life became a series of constant checklists, always worrying if I was doing something right in the eyes of the HOA. I didn't even feel like I lived in my own house anymore. It was like I was a guest, constantly walking on eggshells, wondering if I was going to do something that would trigger yet another complaint. It wasn't just the occasional letter. It was the feeling of being watched all the time, of being told I wasn't good enough, of being made to feel like I didn't belong. I had grown to dread the mailbox every time it clattered open. Every time my doorbell rang, my heart skipped a beat, hoping it wasn't Karen or some other HOA representative with another complaint. I found myself avoiding neighbors, trying to keep my head down, hoping I wouldn't accidentally break another rule. But it didn't work. No matter how hard I tried, Karen always found something, and the HOA always backed her up. Then came the wedding plans. That was the last straw. The moment I found out that Karen had gone behind my back, using the HOA as her tool to essentially commandeer my property for a wedding, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. It was about how she had invaded my space, pushed me around, and made my life miserable for so long. And now she was taking things to a new level. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a complete violation of everything I held dear, my privacy, my sense of ownership, my sanctuary. She wasn't just telling me how to live anymore. She was trying to take the most personal, intimate space I had left and turn it into a public spectacle. I stood there in my kitchen holding the letter, shaking with frustration. The anger that had been building up for years bubbled to the surface, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. For once, I wasn't going to be the nice guy. I wasn't going to let her win. All the times I'd been polite, all the times I'd tried to play by the rules, hadn't done a damn thing. Karen kept pushing, kept invading, kept making me feel small, and now she was doing it again. She was taking something from me, something that was mine, and treating it like it was hers to control. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the frustration of never being able to stand up for myself, of always being pushed around by someone who thought she was better than everyone else. And at that moment, I knew I had a choice to make. I could keep following the rules, keep swallowing my anger, and keep living in this ridiculous charade of politeness. Or I could finally do something about it. For once, I could take control of the situation, fight back against the person who had been running my life from the shadows. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I was done. Done with Karen, done with the HOA, done with living in a world where I was constantly being told what to do and how to do it. The frustration had been building for so long, and this wedding, it was the perfect opportunity. If Karen thought she could take over my yard for some big event without asking, then she was about to learn what happens when you push someone too far. And so the plan formed. It wasn't a rational decision. It wasn't something I sat down and carefully plotted out. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered frustration, a decision driven by the desire to make things right, my way for once. I wasn't just going to let her get away with it. I was going to show her that I still had some control, even if it meant doing something drastic. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the only option. Something had to give. As I stood there in my kitchen, pacing back and forth, I started to think about how far Karen had pushed me. It was like a pressure cooker, building up all this time, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I needed to do something. I had to do something. This wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the years of frustration, the constant feeling that I was powerless, that my life was being dictated by someone who clearly had nothing better to do than ruin everyone else's. At first, I thought about just sitting down and writing a strongly worded letter to the HOA. Maybe a little email to Karen herself, calmly asking her to cancel the whole thing. But that felt weak, too reasonable, too polite. And we all know Karen didn't respond to reasonable. She didn't care about being polite, so why should I? That's when it hit me. Why play nice? Why not throw the whole rules thing out the window and just do something? Something that would really make her understand that I was done. My mind started to wander, imagining the satisfaction of watching her show up on the big day, all excited, only to see nothing. A muddy, flooded disaster. Flood the yard. It sounded crazy. It really did. But the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea. I could just ruin the whole event. Not in some subtle way, no. I was thinking big, bold, and as ridiculously over the top as possible. I could pour dirty water all over the yard. Muddy, grimy, disgusting water. Make it a swamp. Flood the place with a few hundred gallons of water. They'd never be able to set up the wedding. The flowers would be ruined. The catering tables would be floating by the time they showed up. It was perfect. It was poetic. A bit insane, yes. But it was the kind of thing that would send a message. I could almost see Karen's face now. She'd show up all smug, thinking everything was going according to her plan. And then, boom, she'd realize she'd crossed the line with the wrong person. My yard, her dream wedding, both ruined, just like that. And suddenly I was overcome with a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one being pushed around. I wasn't the one doing everything by the book and keeping quiet. I was taking control of the situation. I was doing something about it, and not just something small either. This wasn't just a remove the chairs kind of sabotage. This was flooding the whole damn thing with dirty water. I could almost hear the sound of the water pouring in, the sloshing of it as it pooled across the lawn, taking out anything in its path. The thought of Karen frantically trying to salvage her precious wedding, running around in her heels trying to figure out how to set up a ceremony in a puddle of filth. It was almost too perfect. I stopped pacing for a second and stared out the window. The more I imagined it, the more satisfying it seemed. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? The lengths I was considering going to just to get back at Karen for this nonsense. But honestly, I was done being the nice guy. I had played by the rules long enough. This was my moment of rebellion, and to be totally honest, it felt pretty damn good to imagine how sweet that revenge would be. It wasn't premeditated, at least not in the way I'd originally thought. It wasn't some well-thought-out master plan. It was spontaneous, spur of the moment. It was one of those I've had enough kind of decisions that you make without really thinking about all the consequences. But in the moment, it felt like the most perfect logical response to a lifetime of Karen-induced headaches. And yeah, I knew it was over the top. I knew it sounded like something straight out of a comedy sketch. Flooding my own yard with dirty water to stop a wedding? How insane was that? But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like exactly the kind of insanity that Karen deserved. If she was going to invade my space without even asking, I might as well give her a taste of what it felt like to have her plans turned upside down. It was almost like a weird kind of justice, a way to say, "You've had control over my life for too long. Now I'm calling the shots." I laughed to myself a little. I could already see the headlines in my head. Local homeowner floods yard with dirty water to sabotage HOA president's wedding. The absurdity of it all made me laugh. But deep down, I knew one thing. It was going to feel so damn satisfying. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety, the kind of jittery energy you get when you're about to do something huge, and maybe a little reckless. It was like I had finally reached the edge, and there was no turning back. This wasn't some prank that I could undo. This was big. I had no idea how bad it could get. But honestly, at this point, I didn't care. Karen had pushed me too far. Now it was my turn to push back. I had spent the evening preparing, gathering my materials. The plan was simple in theory, but execution was going to be key. First, I needed water. A lot of it. But not just any water, dirty water, the kind of water that looked like it had been sitting in a dumpster for a week. For this to work, it couldn't just be water. It needed to be filthy, grimy, the kind of stuff you wouldn't even think about touching with a 10-foot pole. I wasn't about to use garden hoses. That would take hours and wouldn't give me the volume I needed. No, I needed something faster, something that would flood the yard in a hurry. So I borrowed a couple of large plastic barrels from a friend, ones that were used for cleaning jobs. These were the kind of barrels you'd find sitting in a warehouse somewhere, filled with industrial-grade cleaning supplies. When I opened them, the smell hit me like a slap in the face. Perfect. It was exactly what I needed. The next step was gathering the grime to make the water truly disgusting. I didn't have to look far. The local car wash was more than willing to sell me a couple of gallons of dirty wash water, the stuff that had been used to clean the greasy tires of cars. It was thick, brown, and smelled like gasoline. I wasn't about to waste a chance to make sure this plan went off without a hitch, so I tossed it in with the barrels. By the time I had everything ready, it was nearly 3 a.m. I was feeling that mix of exhilaration and nervous energy, like I was about to perform some kind of heist. But I couldn't chicken out now. I had committed. I had decided. And now I was going to carry this thing through. The wedding would be happening in just a few hours. I couldn't back down. The next part was the trickiest, getting the water to my yard undetected. I didn't want anyone to see what I was up to, especially Karen. She lived a few houses down, but the last thing I needed was her popping up at the last minute and asking what I was doing. So I made sure to pick the quietest part of the night, when the whole neighborhood was asleep and no one would be out walking their dogs or looking out through their windows. I loaded the barrels onto a small cart and pushed them toward my backyard, making sure to keep the streetlights low and the path clear. The whole time my heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control over my own life. Every step I took toward the backyard, I could already picture Karen's face when she saw the mess I was about to create. Her smug little face, so sure that her plans would go smoothly. That image kept me going, fueled by a sense of justice, or maybe just the thrill of doing something I knew would throw a wrench in her world. Once I reached the back gate, I carefully set up the barrels, aligning them with the edge of the yard. I had planned it so that the water would flow across the lawn, covering as much of it as possible. I'd place small wooden planks underneath the barrels to help them tip over slowly, giving the water just enough time to spread and form pools across the grass. I took a deep breath. It was almost time. I opened the valves and the water poured out, slowly at first, then in steady streams. The brown liquid began to seep into the grass, turning the green into a murky swamp. It spread across the yard, pooling into little lakes, bubbling up in some spots where the soil was softer. The smell was overwhelming, but oddly satisfying. I was doing it. The plan was working. I could already imagine the look on Karen's face when she tried to walk into that mess the next day. The sound of her heels squelching through the muddy mess, her delicate wedding dress dragging in the muck. It was too much. I had to hold back a laugh as I watched the water spread across the yard. It looked like a scene straight out of a disaster movie. But as I stood there watching my little revenge plan come to life, a wave of anxiety hit me. What if it was too much? What if someone saw me? What if it rained overnight and made the mess worse? I had no idea how bad the damage would be by the time the wedding party showed up. But one thing was for sure, there was no turning back. The yard was flooded. The water was everywhere. And it wasn't just a mess, it was a statement. The aftermath? It was going to be messy, I knew that. But for once, I didn't care. The risk was part of it. The consequences? A small price to pay. What would Karen say when she realized she had no place to host her precious wedding? I almost smiled at the thought. The day of the wedding arrived with a heavy, overcast sky hanging low, as if the weather itself had decided to mirror the chaos I'd set in motion. I barely slept the night before, my mind still buzzing with excitement and nerves. I stayed inside, watching the clock tick toward the start of the ceremony. From my window, I could see Karen's house, her wedding preparations already underway. There were flowers, white tents, and a small crowd of guests slowly trickling in. But I wasn't worried about the flowers or the guests. I was worried about the mess, the water, the mud, the disaster I had left in my yard. As I sipped my coffee, I could almost hear the frantic footsteps of Karen and her crew when they arrived at my yard. I pictured them stepping out of their cars dressed to the nines and glancing over at what was supposed to be the idyllic setting for the ceremony. The scene in my mind was pure chaos, the pristine, elegant event, now surrounded by pools of grimy, murky water. It was almost too perfect. I didn't have to wait long to see it unfold. Around midday, I saw Karen and a few of her guests walking toward the yard. They stopped in their tracks as soon as they saw the disaster. I watched from behind my curtains, barely able to contain my grin, as Karen's face morphed from confident to confused to furious in a matter of seconds. Her high heels clicked sharply as she walked to the edge of the yard, standing at the edge of one of the pools of water, looking down at it in disbelief. She didn't scream at first. No, Karen was too composed for that. Instead, she took a breath, as if trying to regain control over the situation. And then her voice rang out, high-pitched and panicked. "This is ridiculous." She waved her arms around as if she could somehow make the mess disappear with sheer force of will. I could hear her muttering to herself, trying to come up with some sort of solution. I wasn't sure if she was trying to convince herself or the wedding party, but I could see her trying to keep it together, even though the damage was too much. She snapped her fingers, ordering a couple of guests to help her fix the situation. I had to fight back a laugh when I saw them grab some cheap tarps from the party supplies and attempt to cover the puddles with them, as if it was going to solve anything. The tarps barely made it halfway across the yard before they started to slip off into the pools, sinking under the weight of the water, leaving a trail of mud behind them. More guests arrived, and as they stepped out of their cars and walked toward the makeshift venue, the chaos multiplied. The women in their long dresses, the men in their tuxedos, they all froze at the sight of the muck-covered yard. I could hear them complaining loudly about their shoes sinking into the slush as they tried to navigate the yard. Some of them attempted to walk around it, but it wasn't long before the entire wedding party was forced to trudge through the dirty water, heels clinking and dress hems dragging. Karen's voice rose above the noise, trying to calm everyone down. "It's fine. It's fine. We can make it work." But her words had no weight. The truth was, there was no making this work. The ground was soggy, the lawn a sloppy mess. Some of the guests were standing on the edges, staring at the disaster like they were waiting for someone to wave a magic wand and fix it. No one knew what to do, and the tension in the air was palpable. I watched it all unfold from the window, the chaos getting worse by the minute. As the guests shuffled around, slipping and stumbling, I caught glimpses of Karen's face. Her eyes were darting around, trying to make sense of the impossible situation she'd found herself in. Her perfect wedding was turning into a nightmare before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. The caterers arrived, and the first thing they did was step into the muck, immediately regretting their decision to come. They looked at Karen like she had completely lost her mind. The officiant was the next one to try and salvage something from the situation. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the yard, checking his notes, as if he had no idea how to proceed. I couldn't blame him. Who in their right mind would be prepared to marry someone in the middle of a swamp? Karen tried to step forward, giving a last-ditch effort to bring some order to the scene. But just as she did, she took a misstep, her foot sinking deep into one of the larger puddles. Her face twisted in shock and disgust as the water splashed up around her, and I swear I saw a tear form in her eye. But she refused to let it show. Instead, she stood there frozen, her expression a mix of rage and humiliation. It was a sight to behold. She looked like she was teetering on the edge of a full meltdown, but somehow she kept herself together, trying to act as if this was just a minor inconvenience. The guests, however, weren't buying it. The tension continued to grow as they tried to navigate the muck, some even turning around and heading back to their cars in frustration. There were whispers among them, murmurs of how ridiculous it was that a wedding could be ruined like this. Her wedding could be ruined like this. I could practically hear them asking themselves, what kind of person does something like this? The whole event seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. I could feel the anticipation of the moment when it would all finally fall apart. The guests were no longer pretending this was an event. They were just trying to survive it. Every step Karen took in the yard was a battle. Every guest a casualty of the chaos. It was clear now. Nothing would go according to plan. It was a train wreck in slow motion, and I couldn't look away. After the wedding disaster unfolded, I stayed inside, watching from my window as the last of the guests trickled out, their expensive shoes ruined, their wedding day dreams shattered by the muck I had created. It was hard to ignore the muffled shouts and the occasional exasperated sigh that drifted through the walls. I knew Karen had to be furious, but something inside me couldn't help but feel a small, twisted sense of satisfaction. But as the last of the wedding party finally left, and the yard returned to its usual silence, I began to think about what was coming next. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, sure, but the real consequences would unfold soon enough. I was too eager to enjoy the feeling of having taken control of the situation, but I knew the HOA, especially Karen, wouldn't let this go. The very next day, I got a knock on the door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, her face as red as a tomato, her wedding dress still a distant memory. Replaced by a cheap, wrinkled outfit, her hair frazzled from the stress. Her voice was cold, but her words were sharp. "You did this on purpose," she hissed, barely able to get the words out without screaming. "You ruined my wedding. You know this means war, right?" I stood there for a moment, just looking at her, and all I could feel was a sick sense of satisfaction. I didn't say anything at first. I just let her rant. She called me a few choice names, none of which I could repeat in polite company, and demanded that I immediately fix the mess I had made. She even threatened to sue me, claiming that I had caused emotional distress and damages to her reputation. I didn't take any of it seriously, though. As much as I hated her, I knew that it was all bluster. She couldn't do anything without involving the HOA, and that's where the real problem lay. The next few days were a whirlwind of HOA meetings, phone calls, and accusations. Karen went straight to the HOA president, and before I knew it, I was getting formal letters warning me of illegal property manipulation or whatever fancy legal term they wanted to use. The HOA had its claws deep in every corner of this neighborhood, and it was clear that Karen wasn't going to let this slide. In their official letter, the HOA demanded that I pay for the cleanup costs, including the removal of the toxic substances I had allegedly introduced into the soil. They claimed I violated some vague clause in the homeowner's agreement about respecting the community environment. There was talk of a fine, and they even hinted at further disciplinary action if I didn't comply. It was like Karen had made sure that every move was part of a bigger, orchestrated attack. Honestly, I was prepared for this. I had known there would be consequences, but I didn't think they'd be as heavy-handed as they turned out to be. The HOA wasn't just angry, they were outraged. They saw this as a direct attack on their authority, and they weren't going to let me off easy. At first I was rattled. The fines and threats started to add up, and there was this underlying pressure from the neighbors, some of whom were getting involved in the HOA's push for justice. I could hear murmurs of disapproval when I went out to pick up the mail, and that made me start questioning if I had gone too far. Maybe I had crossed a line I couldn't easily step back from. But as the days passed, and the anger from the HOA continued to rise, I started to feel a little bit of peace with my decision. In the end, what I had done was undeniable. The dirty water, the chaos, it had all been my doing, yes. But for the first time in a long time, I had stood up for myself. I had taken back some power. Sure, there were consequences, real consequences. But for once, I wasn't the victim of the HOA's rules or Karen's overbearing control. I'd made my statement, and I think that's what made me feel okay about it. But the relationship with the HOA? Well, that would never be the same. From that point on, they looked at me differently, with a kind of wary suspicion. Every meeting, every interaction was tinged with a certain coldness. No more casual neighborly chats. Now every HOA letter that came my way was a reminder of the dirty trick I had pulled. And to be honest, I didn't care. Karen, of course, made it her life's mission to make sure I was labeled as the neighborhood troublemaker. She tried to rally other neighbors against me, but even they began to see the cracks in her facade. Some neighbors whispered that I had actually done them a favor, pointing out that at least Karen wouldn't be able to push them around so easily now that the HOA had seen her true colors. In the end, I think Karen learned something too, though she'd never admit it. She learned that not everyone was going to bow down to her whims. Maybe she thought her position in the HOA made her untouchable. But I had shown her that there were limits. I had pushed back, and for once it felt like the playing field had been leveled. So was it worth it? The fines, the threats, the stares from neighbors? Maybe not if you're looking at it through a purely practical lens. But if you ask me, it was worth it just to see Karen's face when she realized that the power she held over everyone wasn't as secure as she thought. It was worth it to finally feel like I had the upper hand. Would I do it again? Well, that's a question I'll leave unanswered for now. But I'll say this, sometimes a little chaos is the only thing that gets people to wake up. And in that moment, it was exactly what I needed. In the days following the wedding disaster, the neighborhood was buzzing. It didn't take long for word to spread about what had happened. People weren't just talking about the wedding. They were talking about the mess, the Karen wedding, and the revenge that no one had expected. I was avoiding the usual spots, walking my dog around the block, running into neighbors at the corner store, because I knew exactly what would happen. The moment I showed up, I'd get those looks, the whispers behind my back, the sidelong glances. But when I couldn't avoid the inevitable, when I bumped into a neighbor I'd known for years at the mailbox, I was ready for it. At first it was awkward. I could feel the tension hanging in the air as I said hello. But then, in typical small-town fashion, it wasn't long before the conversation turned to the wedding. "Did you hear about the disaster at Karen's?" one neighbor asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She was older, a motherly type who had lived here for decades. "Oh yeah," I said casually, trying to mask any hint of satisfaction. "It was a bit of a mess, wasn't it?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "A bit? Honey, that was chaos. I don't think I've ever seen so many people looking so mad in one place at the same time." And that was the moment I realized that people weren't upset about the mess. They weren't judging me for the dirty water or the ruined shoes. No, they were entertained. It was like I had thrown the most unexpected dramatic show right in the middle of their quiet, peaceful neighborhood. In a way, I had made myself the star of the community drama, and somehow that felt better than I expected. In the days that followed, more neighbors came up to me. Some outright congratulated me on taking down the queen, while others simply nodded with knowing smiles. They didn't always say much, but the look in their eyes said it all. They were all in on the joke. Everyone had been forced to live under Karen's thumb for far too long, And seeing her world fall apart like that, it was cathartic. But not everyone was thrilled. Some of the more neutral neighbors, the ones who tried to stay out of HOA politics, seemed a little uncomfortable with what had happened. They didn't approve of the messy way I'd gone about things. I could see their unease in the way they spoke to me, half-heartedly trying to avoid eye contact, trying to pretend that this wasn't a topic of conversation. A few even told me in hushed tones that what I did was a bit much, or could have been handled differently. But none of them seemed willing to actually stand up to the HOA or Karen, so their disapproval never really felt genuine. But the real surprise came when the younger neighbors, the ones who usually stayed out of HOA squabbles altogether, started chiming in. "You gave her what she deserved," one of them said, leaning against my porch as we both watched Karen's house from a distance, now oddly quiet. "It's about time someone stood up to her." This, of course, set off a whole new wave of gossip. People started talking more openly about Karen's history with the HOA, her micromanaging, and the way she'd always seemed to get her way. For the first time, people were putting the pieces together and realizing that it wasn't just about the mess I made. It was about the bigger picture, the way Karen had bullied her way into controlling everyone's lives for years. And the gossip? It didn't just stay within the neighborhood. As more people found out what had happened, it began to trickle into social media, and soon enough, the infamous Karen wedding became a story that even outsiders were talking about. Someone posted a picture of the flooded yard with a caption like, "When the HOA queen gets a taste of her own medicine," and that quickly went viral in the local area. People were sharing their own horror stories about Karen's antics, and for a while the whole town seemed to be rallying behind me, even if they wouldn't admit it out loud. Karen, on the other hand, was not amused. It didn't take long before she started hearing about how the community was reacting. She had always prided herself on being the neighborhood's enforcer, the one who made sure everyone followed the rules and adhered to the HOA's strict guidelines. Now that image was cracked. I didn't hear much from her directly. She'd practically disappeared after the wedding debacle. But I saw her out in her yard a few times, storming around, talking to the HOA president on the phone. I could tell that, despite her tough exterior, she was privately furious. People in the community were starting to see her for what she was, a control freak who couldn't handle losing power. For the HOA, the entire situation was uncomfortable. They had no real way of punishing me without stirring up more backlash from the neighbors. They sent a few more official letters demanding fines and damages. But every time they did, it seemed like the entire community rallied to my side, almost as if they were waiting for the next letter to come through just to see how it would play out. The HOA's hold on the neighborhood had always been strong, but this incident had exposed a crack in the armor. The more they pushed, the more it felt like the community was leaning toward me, whether they admitted it or not. The lasting effects on the HOA dynamic were clear. The neighbors were more vocal than ever about Karen's behavior, and the whispers of discontent grew louder. No one was particularly eager to follow her orders anymore, and the HOA president, once so supportive of her, was now walking a fine line. The dynamic had shifted. Karen wasn't as untouchable as she once was. She had lost the grip she'd held over everyone for so long. As for me, well, it was clear I had made my mark. The aftermath of the dirty water was messy, sure, but it was also transformative. In a way, I had shaken the foundation of the HOA's reign over our community. People were no longer afraid to speak up. The neighborhood had changed, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like everyone was looking out for each other, even if it meant taking down the queen in the process. Looking back on everything, I'm still not sure if I really learned anything from the whole ordeal, or if it was just pure, unadulterated satisfaction. I won't lie, there was something deeply satisfying about watching Karen's wedding fall apart. The image of her standing there, ankle-deep in muddy water, trying to salvage her perfect day, was exactly what I'd been dreaming about since the first HOA letter arrived on my doorstep. It felt like the universe had finally given me a chance to flip the script and do a little damage control of my own. But did it teach me anything about taking drastic actions? I mean, yeah, kind of. Maybe I learned that sometimes when you've had enough of being pushed around, a little chaos can feel like a personal victory. There's a certain kind of power in throwing the rules out the window and saying, and you know what? I've had enough. But there's also a part of me that knows that kind of action isn't sustainable. Sure, it feels great in the moment, but it leaves a trail of mess behind you, and not just in your yard. As for the HOA, well, things definitely changed. The once iron-fisted grip they had over the neighborhood loosened a bit. People started to speak up more, to question the rules that had been imposed on us for years. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the system that had allowed her to wield so much control. There were murmurs of rebellion, passive-aggressive comments at HOA meetings, and even some neighbors quietly refusing to pay their dues. It wasn't like the HOA was suddenly dissolved or Karen was run out of town on a rail, but the dynamics definitely shifted. People started standing up for themselves, in small ways at first, but those small moments added up. If nothing else, I like to think I gave everyone a little courage. Maybe my dirty water was just a catalyst for something bigger. Or maybe I was just tired of being quiet and letting Karen rule over us all. As for me, well, the thought of regret has crossed my mind. The fines, the dirty looks, the ever-watchful eyes of the HOA. It's all a bit much. But would I take it back? Not a chance. Because if I'm being honest, every time I see Karen now, walking around with that forced, tight smile on her face, trying to maintain that illusion of control, I can't help but think, yeah, I did that. So was it worth it? Absolutely. But don't get me wrong. If I ever have another confrontation with the HOA, I think I'll opt for something a little less waterlogged. Maybe a passive-aggressive letter or a few strategically placed garden gnomes. Who knows? You've got to leave some surprises for next time. But here's the kicker. Karen didn't learn a damn thing. She's still out there, trying to get everyone to follow her rules, as if she didn't just have the most embarrassing moment of her life broadcasted in front of the whole neighborhood. She's probably plotting her next move, thinking she's going to take back control somehow. And me? Well, I've got a yard full of perfectly good grass now, no HOA letters threatening me, and a sense of peace that can only come from knowing you've ruined someone's wedding in the most satisfying way possible. So yeah, I guess you could say it was totally worth it.